Did you ever lose a game of TFT because of a bug? Honestly, I can think of a few that ruined my life. Blitzcrank! Knowing what to avoid might save you some trouble in the future. So let's take a look at 10 different mechanics that could use a fly swatter. But just before we get started, I'm willing to bet that you can't subscribe to this channel before this fiddlesticks reaches 1000 AP. Are you ready? Go! And hey, even if you didn't make it, I still appreciate your support. Let's get started. In patch 13.1, Riot fixed a bug that caused 3 pranksters to heal for more than intended. I'm not sure if this was the cause, but ever since this change, I noticed something funny about my pranksters. They kept dashing forward. I decided to look more into it, and this is what I found. If prankster units are surrounded in the front and on the sides, once they drop low enough to activate the prankster effect, they will dash into the opponent's corner. As long as you make sure that the prankster isn't full mana at the same time as the effect happens, you can quite reliably send units to mess with the opponent's backline. This works especially well with units like Riven, because she's a defender and will aggro the enemy units onto her, which causes her to drop low, while simultaneously the units blocking these spaces stay alive. But remember, no abusing in solo queue. It is pretty clear nowadays that Riot is not a fan of the so-called Exodia tanks, which are units that with the correct setup are pretty much unkillable. That's why every set Riot gives the players a unit that can get rid of them. In set 8, this unit is Leona, who summons a laser beam that is dealing a very large amount of true damage for a very long time, which tends to get the job done. To make sure that Leona stays in safety, it's not uncommon to position her in the last row with tons of mana items so she can cast at the start of the fight. Since her ability is global, this allows you to snipe the enemy tank from safety. This sounds great, but something that is incredibly awkward about this interaction is the fact that Leona decides her target not based on distance, but on her pathing. If you end up running so many melee units in your frontline that the only spaces left open are at the very edge, then Leona will prioritize her ability on units who are standing at the side. So the next time you're playing a Leona with full mana, make sure to keep a spot open next to the target that you're aiming for. Emblems and TFT have a weird relationship. On one hand, they are responsible for some of the coolest interactions we have ever seen. On the other hand, they end up creating more bugs than you could possibly imagine. Set 8 is no exception here. So let me introduce you to the most broken item that we have, the Spellslinger Emblem. It has 2 super weird interactions with Jax and Yuumi. If you make Jax into a Spellslinger and activate the trait, he will straight up stop dealing magic damage. A quick side-by-side comparison makes it pretty obvious that you have a huge DPS loss. Yuumi, on the other hand, is even crazier. Her max ability range is based on her attack range. But if the last attack before she casts is a Spellslinger proc, her ability becomes global and will end up flying across the entire board into the opposite corner. Not even positioning can save you anymore. Radiant items are without a doubt quite powerful, but there is one Radiant item that stayed among the top choices from the very beginning, the Radiant Thief Gloves. It's honestly always a great choice, but it has a dangerous secret. Normally, if a unit has 1 or 2 items already, then you can't add Thief Gloves anymore, but with Radiant Gloves, it's different. It will still get placed on the unit, which honestly looks quite wrong.
Look at this dude.
But this is not a visual bug. In this example, I have a jeweled gauntlet on my Jinx, and I end up adding the Radiant Gloves. The jeweled gauntlet now doesn't show up anymore, but the game still remembers the critical strike chance and the AP, and in fact, if Jinx uses her ability, she will critically strike. It can also work in a different way. For example, in this clip, we can see that one of the Radiant items is hidden, and it turns out it was a Radiant Zephyr that still managed to proc on the enemy Ezreal. This probably qualifies as the cheesiest Zephyr strategy. The next one is going to be somewhat of an honorable mention, since apparently Riot fixed a bug that caused massive issues with Sona. If you paid attention to what this unit was doing, you realized fast something was seriously wrong with her.
I need healing. I need healing.
A normal Sona fires 2 beams, which can be increased to 3 with her carry augment. In her second ability cast, she will heal her lowest allies for a small amount, but this was not working reliably at all. She seemed to have a preference of healing her furthest ally over her lowest allies, even if the unit in your corner was full HP, effectively wasting half of her ability. Sona didn't even seem to care if your unit died before she had full mana, she still prioritized the dead unit. With this bug gone, Sona carry might honestly become a viable option now. Speaking of Zephyr, this item isn't always doing what it's supposed to. A great example to showcase this is with Nunu. Nunu has a unique interaction with Zephyr because for some reason he is still targetable but also invincible when he gets hit. Most players don't realize this, but if you ended up hitting a Zephyr on a Nunu in the backline while also trying to pick off the enemy carry with Hecarim, you would end up wasting a considerable amount of time. If you want to push this even further, then you can move your Nunu isolated in the front line to make sure he gets hit by the opponent's Zephyr. The entire team will now focus on your Nunu without dealing damage, though this strategy will cause him to die very fast once the Zephyr runs out. According to the internet, Zoe is smarter than she looks, but I take issue with that, at least in TFT. Here, she throws a bubble dealing magic damage over time, and she tries to prioritize units that aren't affected yet. Usually, you build her with blue buff and Morello as her core, and this item build is perfectly fine, but if you try to deviate, you start running into some serious problems. Mana items like Shojin or Manazane will create situations where she ends up receiving full mana before her initial bubble has reached her target. From her point of view, the unit is not affected yet, so she will end up sending another bubble, effectively wasting an entire cast cycle. So the next time you get a Gadgeteen Shojin, maybe it's better to give it to somebody else. Mascots have a pretty cool mechanic where they run to the sidelines and cheer for your remaining team, which increases their health regen every few seconds. Watching a tiny version of your unit dance can be quite cute, but it is somewhat obvious that this would create a lot of bugs in the long run. One issue a lot of players experience is the fact that the mascots can still receive items on the sidelines. This can create some very unfortunate misplays if you try to give one of your units an item to influence the outcome of the fight and it ends up on one of your dead mascots.
Was? Wen hab ich mein... Dude! There's no way! Mordok! Mordok!
Something that happens a lot less often involves laser cores. If you end up giving a mascot a laser core emblem and it dies, thankfully it will transfer the drones it collected, but not the one it started with. Very greedy. In my last video, I briefly touched on the topic of delaying your items to give yourself an advantage. For example, by delaying your Edge of Night so you can choose yourself when you proc the effect. Now I'm aware this strategy does have some limited use, but there's one very interesting interaction involving Fiddlesticks that I wanted to share. The way Fiddlesticks work is that he always requires a viable target when he's casting his ability. If you have a single unit left on your board and the enemy Fiddlesticks is starting his channel, you can use the Edge of Night trick to make your unit into an invalid target. As a consequence, Fiddlesticks will now stop his channel and lose all of his mana, which has the potential of turning the tides in your favor. As for our final bug, let's take a closer look at something that tends to go unnoticed most of the time: unit size. You'd be surprised, but throughout the history of TFT, we've had several interactions where unit size ended up making a difference in an ability hitting or missing. Set 8 is no exception here, and the best way to showcase what I'm talking about is to take a look at Jinx. She fires a rocket that stops at the first enemy hit, stunning and dealing magic damage to everyone in a 1 hex range. However, if Jinx, her target, has a fully stacked Titan's Resolve, which increases the size of the unit, she will now be unable to damage any of the nearby targets, causing you to potentially lose a teamfight. Well, this concludes my list, for now. I have a gut feeling this won't be the last video I'll be making about bugs. Which one was your favorite? Let me know in the comments. I hope you learned something, and see you next time.